What if in the year 1855, off the bleak shores of Maine, a vessel carved from oak and iron was found drifting, stripped of its breath? Its crew vanished as if swallowed whole by the abyss. What if the Mary Celeste, a ship meant to carry souls and cargo alike, became instead a floating coffin of silence, an omen to all who dared glance upon her weather-stained deck? This is no tale of empty waters. This is a story of absence so loud, it deafened generations. And as you step into the hollow corridors of this forgotten voyage, let the shadows take hold. If you dare walk these decks with me, subscribe now, so T. The year was 1855, in the chill, iron-gray harbors of Maine, where the forest met the sea and the sea met the bones of men. From the deep pines, trees were felled like giants brought low, their sap bleeding onto the snow, their trunks dragged to shipyards where hammers rang like funeral bells. Out of this frozen labor, out of sweat and blood, the Mary Celeste was born. She was meant to be a vessel of commerce, a proud brigantine of oak and pitch, but even at her birth, whispers clung to her timbers like cobwebs to a coffin lid. The men who shaped her spoke in hushed tones of accidents in her construction. A carpenter's hand split open beneath a saw, spilling blood into the sawdust that mixed with resin and brine. Another man fell from the scaffolding and broke his spine, his scream cut short by the cracking of bones on ice. Some swore that the planks of the vessel drank the blood, sealing it into the grain. From her very keel to her towering masts, she carried the stains of men who had given more than sweat. The christening day was no gentler. As the bottle shattered against her prow, a storm rose sudden and wild, winds whipping the harbor into frenzy, nearly wrenching the vessel from her berth before she had ever tasted the open sea. Fishermen who watched muttered of ill omens, their voices rough with salt and tobacco smoke. "She is cursed," one whispered. "The sea will not keep her." Another spat into the water and swore he saw the foam curl back like a serpent, as though the ocean itself had listened and agreed. Still, ships are built not from blessings, but from necessity, and the Mary Celeste was launched despite the dread that clung to her like frost. Her early voyages were uneasy. She was never a swift vessel, always sluggish, her sails seeming to sag even when wind filled them full. Cargo spoiled inexplicably, barrels of flour souring in mere weeks, fruit blackening as though rot had traveled with her in the dark. Her profits limped, her crews shifted constantly, sailors deserting her name in taverns, muttering of strange sounds in her hold. The clank of chains in empty corners, the creak of footsteps across an unpeopled deck, the low hum of something that was not quite wind. At night, her narrow cabins became places of unease. Men swore they woke to the sound of whispers just beyond their hammocks, words too soft to catch, too cold to be human. Lamps guttered out for no reason. Water barrels turned brackish though they had been sealed. Once, in the black silence of a crossing, a deckhand opened a hatch to find a thick fog coiled inside the hold, unmoving as though it had grown there, a living thing breathing in the dark. Superstition is the marrow of every sailor, and soon the Mary Celeste was shunned by those who valued their lives over wages. Yet the sea is greedy and men desperate, and so she sailed again and again, her masts cutting across skies of storm and fire, her decks trembling beneath men who dared whisper the word curse. Every voyage left behind rumors like driftwood, warnings passed in hushed voices over rum and lamplight. Some ships are mere machines, wood and nail and cloth. Others are born breathing. And some, like the Mary Celeste, are born already dying. But in the winter of her most fateful departure, the curse whispered louder. She left harbor not as a vessel of trade, but as a coffin in waiting, her sails swallowing the horizon, her timbers moaning with secrets. The waters ahead lay still as though listening. Something in the dark waited, patient and hungry. And when the sea waits, she does not wait in vain. The harbor behind them shrank into mist, the cries of families fading to whispers swallowed by the wind. It was late autumn, and the sea off Maine already carried the bite of winter. The Mary Celeste groaned as her sails filled, strained as though she resisted the journey even as she obeyed her captain's command. Her crew, sailors hardened by storms and hunger, clutched their coats tighter, staring ahead with eyes that carried both duty and dread. For all the world, it seemed like a voyage like countless others. Rope coiled on deck, barrels stacked below, the captain pacing with a stern gaze. And yet beneath the rhythm of work, silence pooled, thick and uneasy. The first days passed without violence, but unease grew as surely as the tides. Meals were sparse, hardtack stiff as bone, salted meat crawling with maggots. Hunger gnawed more than flesh, it scraped at temper and spirit alike. Sailors muttered in the dark of the hold that the ship's provisions rotted faster than nature allowed, as though some unseen rot lived in the wood itself. By night, as the sea sighed around them, whispers stirred in the corners of the deck. Some claimed to hear weeping in the timbers. Others spoke of the sound of waves breaking inside the hold, though the barrels were sealed tight. Then came the storms. The sky blackened without warning, lightning cracking the heavens apart, thunder shaking the marrow of men. The sails snapped like bones breaking, ropes screamed against the masts, and the ocean rose in walls of iron water. The men lashed themselves to the rigging, their eyes wide with terror, as the sea clawed at the ship with a hunger that felt personal. For hours the storm consumed them. When dawn finally cracked through the smoke-gray clouds, they were alive, but changed. Faces pale, hands trembling, voices hushed as if they feared the storm could still hear them. Days stretched into weeks, the voyage gnawed down to a rhythm of fear and silence. Sleep grew restless. Men tossed in their hammocks, muttering of shapes seen in dreams, figures watching from the waves, pale eyes in the foam. Some swore they saw fires glowing beneath the surface, red light burning in the deep as if the ocean floor itself smoldered. Each dawn the crew looked older, hollower, their cheeks sunken, their eyes clouded. Then came the disappearances. First it was a deckhand, last seen climbing the rigging at dusk. When the morning bell rang, his hammock was empty, his rope dangling free. No cry, no splash, no struggle. Then another, a cook, vanished from the galley, leaving his ladle still resting in a pot of stew gone cold. Fear spread like infection. Men clutched charms, whispered prayers, cast nervous glances over their shoulders. They searched every inch of the ship, from keel to crow's nest, but found nothing. The captain barked orders louder, his face carved with worry he dared not voice. He forbade talk of curses, yet even his hands trembled when he held his compass. Each day the crew thinned, each night the shadows seemed to multiply. Sailors swore they heard footsteps pacing above when the deck was empty, or saw figures climbing the rigging only for the masts to stand bare against the sky. By the time the horizon stretched endless and featureless, the crew no longer spoke freely. They moved like men walking through a graveyard, each step heavy with dread. And in the captain's journal, ink smeared and jagged, a new entry appeared. "We are devoured, but not by hunger alone. The sea watches, the sea waits." The voyage pressed on, but already the ship felt less a vessel and more a coffin afloat, carrying men who still breathed, yet already belonged to the silence. The question was no longer if they would vanish, but when. The storm that struck them next was not of rain and wind alone, but of something older, something that seemed to tear at the very fabric of breath and bone. The sea rose black as obsidian, waves curling like claws reaching to drag the ship into the abyss. The sky split in furious white, lightning carving jagged scars across the horizon, thunder bellowing like 1,000 drums of war. The Mary Celeste pitched and groaned, her timbers screaming as though alive, as though she herself felt the pain of each crashing blow. Men clung to rope and mast, their bodies whipped raw by salt and rain, their eyes burning with terror that words could not contain. For 3 nights the storm howled without pause. Men were lashed to the deck, their hands bloodied from holding rope, their faces pale specters in the ceaseless lightning. They prayed into the wind, but their voices drowned, torn away before they could rise. The sea roared louder than God, louder than any mercy, and when the storm finally broke, silence fell heavier than the chaos had ever been. It was then the whispers began. At first the crew thought it was exhaustion, the mind conjuring tricks from hunger and sleeplessness. Yet as dawn rose pale and sickly, men heard voices where no voices should be. At night, in hammocks damp with sweat, some woke to the sound of someone murmuring their name. Others swore they heard sobbing in the narrow passageways below deck, though no one was there. Shadows lengthened in unnatural ways, stretching far across planks though the lanterns burned low. One sailor, his voice shaking, swore he saw a man standing on the waves just beyond the bow, watching with hollow eyes before vanishing into the fog. The captain tightened his jaw, writing furiously in his journal though he spoke nothing aloud. His orders grew sharper, his eyes bloodshot. He dismissed the whispers, forbade mention of phantoms, but his hands shook as he traced the map. The men knew he, too, had heard them. One night the galley lamp extinguished itself without cause. When the cook relit it, its flame sputtered and bent, though no wind stirred. A deckhand found rope burns etched into his wrists, though he swore no rope had touched him in sleep. Another woke screaming, clawing at his own throat, crying that something had tried to drag him down into the mattress, as if the bed itself had turned into water. By the fourth night after the storm, no man slept soundly. The silence of the sea had become unbearable, the water too calm, the horizon too still. In that stillness, whispers seemed to grow bolder, echoing in the bones of the ship. Sometimes they came from below, sometimes above, sometimes from just behind the ear. Sailors walked with hollow eyes, muttering prayers that no longer brought comfort. Then, as fog closed around the ship like a shroud, one of the younger sailors vanished. His boots remained neatly placed by his hammock, his blanket still warm, but his body was nowhere. No splash had been heard, no cry. He had simply ceased to exist. The whispers swelled that night, louder than before, though no tongue could shape them. The men huddled in silence, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down like chains. And when dawn broke, pale and merciless, it revealed faces gaunt and gray, men no longer certain whether they dreamed or lived. The ship carried them still, but each day she carried fewer souls. And with each disappearance, the silence grew thicker, darker, as though the ocean itself waited to close its fist around the last of them. The discovery came weeks later, when another vessel spotted a lone brigantine drifting on the open Atlantic, its sails tattered, its motion sluggish as though it were breathing its last. The wind tugged at her canvas, but she did not answer with speed. She only drifted, directionless, abandoned. When the lookout shouted her name, the words carried across the waves like a curse, Mary Celeste. Cautiously, a boarding party was sent. They rowed through waters as still as glass, their oars cutting ripples into silence too perfect, too absolute. One man muttered a prayer beneath his breath, though his hands trembled as he gripped the gunwale. The Mary Celeste loomed above them, her hull salt-stained and scarred, her rigging swaying in the idle breeze. No voices called from her deck, no sound of life stirred within. She floated, but she was lifeless, a corpse of wood and cloth. When the first boots struck her deck, the men froze. There was no blood, no signs of battle, no corpses sprawled in shadow. The ship was intact, her cargo untouched, barrels lined neatly as if awaiting inspection. And yet her lifeboat was gone, its ropes cut clean. The deck smelled not of gunpowder or decay, but of brine and old silence. A galley door creaked open in the wind, its hinges moaning like the throat of something strangled. They entered the captain's quarters, and there the unease grew colder. His belongings remained in place, charts scattered, a pipe half-packed with tobacco, a pair of boots resting beneath the bunk. The bed itself was neatly made, as though abandoned only moments before. The men glanced at one another, eyes wide, for they could not reconcile the order with the absence. No man departs so suddenly from a life so carefully arranged. In the galley, food waited half-prepared, a pot of stew congealed into gray ruin, loaves of bread hardened into stone. Knives lay mid-cut, spoons abandoned mid-stir. Whatever had pulled the crew from this ship had done so in the very heartbeat of living. Below deck, a child's toy was found, crudely carved from wood, a ribbon tied to its arm. It lay upon the planks as though dropped mid-play. One sailor, hardened by storm and war, turned away with his jaw clenched, unwilling to speak of the image that toy conjured in his mind. A child's hand pulled from it too quickly, never to return. The boarding men whispered to each other that they felt watched. Though the cabins were empty, though the hammocks swayed with no bodies within, the air seemed thick with presence. Shadows shifted against the timbers, stretching as if some unseen thing still paced the deck. More than one man confessed later that he could not shake the sensation of breath on the back of his neck, though when he turned, there was only emptiness. They searched every corner, every rope, every hatch. They found no struggle, no bodies, no signs of death, and yet the absence itself was worse than any massacre, for blood speaks, it tells of violence, of an end. But here nothing spoke, nothing but silence so vast it roared in their ears. When they departed, rowing back across the still sea, none looked behind. They left the Mary Celeste to drift once more, carrying not a soul, yet not empty. Something clung to her deck, something unseen, and the men who touched her knew it would follow them in dreams forever. And so the legend of Mary Celeste was born, not in blood, but in silence, in the kind of absence that chills the marrow more than death itself. But if no battle, no storm, no violence had claimed her crew, then what had? When the Mary Celeste was towed to port, the world erupted in whispers. Newspapers carried her name like a dark hymn, taverns brimmed with rumors, and courts filled with theories that tangled tighter than rigging in a storm. No one could accept that a ship could drift bloodless, lifeless, untouched. There had to be a crime. There had to be blood spilled, even if none was found. The first suspicion fell upon mutiny. Men imagined the crew rising against their captain, their voices hushed no longer but sharp with defiance. Perhaps the captain was cruel, perhaps discipline had splintered into rage, and in the black of night, knives flashed and bodies tumbled into the sea. The mutineers, some said, might have fled with the lifeboat, hoping to reach land unseen. But if so, why leave the cargo? Why abandon barrels of alcohol, flour, and goods that could buy safety and freedom? And why leave the captain's quarters untouched, his boots still neatly beneath the bed, his charts still spread as though he had stepped out for air and never returned? Then came whispers of pirates. The Atlantic was no stranger to blades in the dark, to sails bearing down at dusk. Perhaps marauders had taken the crew, sparing cargo but not lives, yet seasoned sailors shook their heads. Pirates are creatures of profit. They do not leave treasure untouched, nor vessels floating without claim. The cargo's value was untouched. The pirate's tail collapsed under its own weight. Theories grew darker. Some insisted the ship's hold bore the scent of fire. Indeed, stains of char were found on barrels below deck, suggesting that an explosion or the threat of one might have driven the crew into desperate flight. Perhaps they fled in panic, fearing flames that never came, abandoning ship in haste and finding only death in the endless water. It was plausible, almost comforting in its grim logic. Yet sailors who walked her decks whispered that the stains looked wrong, not like fire's kiss but like something deeper, as though the wood itself had wept black tears. And then there were the stories of bones. Along the coasts of Africa, men claimed fragments washed ashore, splintered ribs, a child's jawbone, a sailor's femur. No proof ever held, but the stories spread, dripping from mouth to mouth until they became gospel in the taverns of Lisbon, London, and New York. Some swore they were cursed relics, tokens of the Mary Celeste's hunger. Others dismissed them as tales spun for coin. Still, the rumor clung, refusing to be drowned. The courts tried to sow reason into the fabric of madness. They summoned witnesses, examined logs, studied stains. But reason could not bind the silence that clung to the vessel. Each thread they wove unraveled, each theory broke. The Mary Celeste remained defiant, her mystery intact, her silence deeper than testimony. Men who took command of her after her discovery spoke of unease. Crews rotated quickly, unable to stomach her name. One captain confessed that the vessel breathed at night, her planks groaning in a rhythm too steady, too deliberate. Another claimed to hear footsteps above his bunk when none walked the deck. The ship, once a machine of trade, had become a specter. She carried not just cargo but suspicion, not just timbers but the bones of rumor. Every voyage that followed her rediscovery seemed shadowed, as though she dragged her curse behind her like a net. But suspicion was only the surface. Beneath it, deeper than courts, darker than rumor, lay the journals, the written words of a captain whose ink bled with fear, whose hunger etched terror into every line. And when those pages surfaced, They whispered of something far when the journal was unearthed. It was said the ink smelled still of salt, as though the sea itself had licked its pages clean before letting them fall into mortal hands. Bound in weathered leather, the cover bore stains dark as dried blood, and its edges curled as if singed by unseen fire. Scholars, sailors, and priests alike bent over its lines, and what they found did not bring clarity, it brought dread. The entries began steady, firm as the hand of command. The captain recorded the course, the weather, the provisions, but already beneath the lines of discipline unease leaked through. He noted barrels spoiling faster than expected, water casks souring in days instead of weeks, bread turning to stone beneath careful seal. Hunger prowled the ship like a lean wolf, teeth flashing in every shadow. Men grew gaunt, their tempers short, their eyes hollow. At night their whispers turned to arguments, their arguments to silence. Days bled into weeks and the writing shifted. His once steady script faltered, words rushed, smudged as though written with a trembling hand. He described storms that rose from clear skies, black walls of water that struck without warning, leaving the ship battered and the crew staring at one another with fear so sharp it cut the air. He wrote of voices, a chorus below the waves, that seemed to sing in tones too deep for the human ear. The men, he said, pressed their ears to the planks and swore they heard something breathing beneath them. In one entry, the captain confessed he could no longer tell dream from waking. He saw faces in the rigging, pale and eyeless, staring down at him. He heard footsteps pacing the deck at night, though every man was accounted for in his hammock. He described one sailor who woke screaming, his mouth full of seawater though he had not left his bed. Another refused to eat, muttering that every bite of bread was filled with ash. Then hunger deepened. His words turned sharp, desperate. The men weaken, we divide rations, yet the sea takes more than we can spare. Their cheeks sink, their hands tremble, their eyes no longer see me, they see only the waves. The ink darkened in places where his hand pressed harder, as though each stroke carved fear into the paper itself. The final entries descended into fragments. Sentences cut short, words repeated. The sea watches, the sea waits. Over and over scrawled across margins as though he could not stop himself. The last coherent passage spoke of lights. Strange fire burns upon the water, not lightning, not man's flame. The crew stares hollow. They hear it calling. I feel it too. If I close my eyes, I see her face. No flesh, no bone, only salt and silence. The final page bore no conclusion. No farewell, no resolution, only one word scratched so violently it tore the paper. Hunger. Scholars later debated whether the journal was authentic, forged, or corrupted by myth. Some dismissed it as the ramblings of a man driven mad by storms and starvation. Others swore its words were too raw, too desperate to be anything but truth. And yet none could explain the chill that clung to the ink, nor the way the letters seemed to shift under lamplight, as though still alive, still breathing. If the sea does indeed wait, then perhaps Mary Celeste was not abandoned by chance, nor by human error, but by a hunger deeper than flesh, an ancient claim that takes not only bodies but souls. And if the sea claims once, she does not forget. She waits for more. The Mary Celeste sailed on long after her crew was swallowed, as though the ship herself refused to die. Men claimed her decks, tried to tame her curse, but misfortune stalked every voyage. Cargo spoiled, storms found her even in calm seasons, and sailors deserted at ports rather than hear her name again. She became less a vessel of trade and more a vessel of fear, drifting from captain to captain, each one leaving with eyes hollow, as though something had followed them home. Her end, when it came, was not glorious. She was run aground, stripped, and left to rot like a carcass on the shore. Her bones lay bleaching beneath the sun, her ribs open to wind and gull. Children played in her ruins, clambering over her mast as though it were the spine of some great beast slain.